which will be by David Thomson. And David has been a regular attendee of our Citizen Scientist Hours, and I'd like to just give a little bit of background to David before he presents what promises to be a very interesting presentation to us this evening. David is a research associate of the BDI, and I think, as many of us in this forum, he has had an interest in the natural world from an early age. He studied zoology at Aberdeen University and went on to do a PhD at Glasgow University in Scotland. He then worked as a quantitative ecologist at the British Trust for Ornithology, and he has always been involved in utilizing data collected by citizen scientists to conduct his research, and particularly how this data relates to dealing with environmental issues. David then moved to the Netherlands Institute of Ecology and worked with citizen science networks throughout Europe. And then he took up the role as research group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Germany. And this led to academic appointments, firstly in Hong Kong and then at the United Arab Emirates University. And David's interests in research are particularly related to how wildlife populations respond and adapt in changing environments. And he enjoys cross-disciplinary work and combining ideas, approaches, concepts, and insights from the various fields of disciplines from ecology, demography, mathematics, climatology, statistics, and physiology. And as he is going to be presenting to us this evening, he is particularly interested in the impacts of climate change in hot regions and in how quantitative analytical approaches can be applied to this data, long-term, large-scale data sets that are produced by citizen scientists. David, we are we are thrilled to have you presenting to us this evening, and we look forward to what you have to say to us in your presentation, which is titled Upper Thermal Limits and the Ecological Impact of Rising Temperatures in Hot Regions. Over to you.
Good. Thank you very much, Rick, for a very kind introduction. As I say, I'm going to talk about upper thermal limits and the ecological impact of rising temperatures in hot regions. I'd like to credit especially Sanak Ghosh. So this work has been done as part of his master's studies. One second. There we go. Yeah, so this is Sanak. And right, so this is the first slide, and this is from NASA, and it shows the changes in temperature which have been happening throughout the globe since 1884. But just before we talk about that, and before I tell you what I think, we thought it'd be good to give you the chance to say what you think. So I'm very pleased that Ataso has helped me with this. And we've set up some of the Zoom polling feature. So, Tasso, can we have the first question?
First question.
Yeah, there we go. So before I tell you what I think, if you let me know what you think, where do you think the biggest ecological impacts of climate change will be felt? We're giving you the three choices: either the high northern latitudes, or the mid-temperate latitudes, or the hot tropical latitudes. Good, so 58% of people think the high northern latitudes, about a third of us think the hot tropical latitudes, and 8% think the mid-temperate latitudes. Yeah, I'll now spend the rest of the talk telling you what I think. I've always been brought up to think that the The best research is the research that changes the way people think. So we'll see if people think differently by the end of the talk. But in any case, we've got a majority thinking high northern latitudes, but a substantial number of people thinking maybe hot tropical latitudes. So let's close that down. I think you can click close on that. So as I say, this is from NASA, this map, and this is the change in temperature. So this is not the impact, it's the change in the physical temperature since 1884. And if it's dark red color, it means that the temperature has increased substantially. If it's a paler color, then the temperature is not increased by so much. And I guess this is why 2/3 of people in this audience think that the biggest ecological impacts of climate change will be in the high northern latitudes. I think this particular audience is quite Africa focused. So you're in a hot region, you've got that African hot region focus and context. So I say more of this audience is focusing on the hot regions. Globally, there's evidence that it's still very widely thought that the biggest impacts of climate change will be felt in these high northern regions. That is what we might call the consensus view, or the majority view at the moment. Now I need to make sure I stay in PowerPoint. Yeah, there we go. So it's widely assumed that the greatest impacts will be in these cool northern regions. If we look at where people are doing their research, so every 5 years or so, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN IPCC, publishes these synthesis reports, several thousand scientists drawing together several tens of thousands, I mean now actually hundreds of thousands of publications on climate change and its impacts. And there have been studies to look at where these studies are being done. The indications are that less than 1% of global research on the impacts of climate change has been done in hot tropical regions. So there's a very heavy emphasis on these regions, these non-tropical, non-hot regions. This is partly driven by the fact that the biggest temperature changes are happening in the high north. But there's also, of course, the issue that most of the world's universities and research institutes are concentrated in North America, in Europe, in some of these developed countries, maybe Japan, Australia, New Zealand. So these tend to be maybe not the high north or the polar regions, but certainly the temperate regions rather than the hot or tropical regions. And I've noticed in a number of presentations in these BDI Citizen Science Hours, a lot of us are talking about the fact that there's all these biodiversity resources in Africa, and yet a relatively small fraction of the world's research being done in Africa. So we've currently got this perception and this big emphasis on cooler regions. But although this is the majority view, it's not the universal view. There's still some people there are emerging voices who are suggesting that the biggest impacts might actually be in the hot regions. Why that should be, we can imagine that as climate changes, things may get too hot, and that's a source of concern. But it's possible for environments not just to be too hot, but also to be too cold. And if it's too cold and the temperatures rise, then the performance of organisms will actually increase. Now we can measure the performance of organisms in various ways. I guess in an ideal world, we would measure it in terms of fitness, in terms of the ability of organisms to survive and to reproduce. And that has been done, that can be done. It can be done with citizen science data. But one of the things that would be very popular is the use of physiological metrics. So people looking at the physiological performance of organisms, looking at how that increases with temperature, how it reaches a peak, so it reaches an optimal temperature. And that optimal temperature is an important temperature because it's the point at which the effects of rising temperatures stop being positive and start being negative. And there's been a certain amount of interest in the possibility that species in hot regions may already be living at or above these optimal temperatures. Now, in this talk, I'm not going to focus on the optimal temperature, but I'm going to focus on a thing called the upper critical temperature. This is a concept which applies really to ectothermic species. In fact, these thermal performance curves really refer primarily to ectothermic species. I should say that the temperature axis here on the x-axis is the body temperature rather than the environmental temperature, and the y-axis is performance, which could be measured in a range of ways. If you're using physiological metrics, it could be the speed at which organisms can respond, speed at which they can run. It could be metabolic rate, heart rate, breathing rate, reaction speed, all sorts of different metrics. And as I say, there's this concept of an upper critical temperature, which is the temperature at which that functioning ceases. So this is, I mean, you don't want to take organisms there. It's not a good place to go. But if you were measuring the upper critical temperature, or if you're measuring performance in terms of sprint speed, the speed at which a lizard can run away, for example, then the upper critical temperature would be the temperature at which the lizard can no longer run away. So it's not necessarily the temperature at which they drop dead, but it's the point at which the physiology can no longer function. And there's a possibility, of course, that species in hot regions may be getting within reach of that upper critical temperature. It's possible that species in cold regions are still somewhere below it. But of course, the issue of that, whether that's true, depends on what these upper critical temperatures are. Now, as I say, upper critical temperatures are not a nice place to go, and on principle, I refuse to take organisms up to those temperatures. But there's been a large number of studies which have been done throughout the world, which have quantified them. And given that that's been done, we were keen just to synthesize that information and to look at where they are and to look at the risks faced by species in hot regions and in cold regions. So again, before I tell you what we think, how about if we let you tell us what you think? So do we have the next question? So here we go. The question is, where do you think most ectothermic animals hit their upper thermal limits? And the choices are 0 to 10 degrees, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, or 50 to 60. Right, so we say, where do you think most ectothermic animals hit their upper thermal limits? And about half of us think that it's somewhere between 30 and 40 degrees. Nobody says 50 to 60, about 10% saying 40 to 50. About a quarter of us think it's somewhere between 20 and 30. Nobody says between 10 and 20. And some people say between 0 and 10. So those are interesting, interesting results. So let's have a look at what Sanak found when he synthesized all these data. I should say, incidentally, you might be thinking as an ecologist, you know, this upper critical temperature isn't very meaningful. You might be thinking to yourself, well, you know, that's the temperature at which the physiology shuts down for the whole population. And ecologically, you can imagine species might be, you know, encountering difficulty, finding it difficult to survive and reproduce, going into decline, going extinct long before we reach these upper critical temperatures. And that's certainly true. But it's still an interesting metric. It's still a meaningful metric. And from an ecological point of view, if organisms are at risk of reaching those temperatures, then they really are in trouble. So Sanak synthesized data from a large number of studies from all over the world. And he managed to find 726 studies on ectothermic species. And if I can just explain this graph, we start at 0 degrees centigrade, and we're not necessarily saying that all of these species can live at 0 degrees centigrade. We're just saying that none of them have yet reached their upper thermal limit at 0 degrees centigrade. So we've got 726 species still standing at 0 degrees centigrade. Now, at 4.5 degrees centigrade, the first species drops out. So there's an Antarctic mollusk that says 4.5 degrees centigrade is just too much and it's time to get out of the kitchen. So we lose a species at 4.5. There's a few that we're losing below 10. There's a couple at 9. But you can see that between 0 and 10 degrees, even though we are losing species, we're not losing very many. So the number of species alive at 10 is not much less than the number alive at 0. Now, similarly, as you move from 10 to 20, there's a few species that say it's too hot, I'm getting out the kitchen. But again, not many. So most of these 726 species are still there at 20 degrees centigrade. As you move above 20 degrees centigrade, again, you find that there's not an awful lot of loss. As you start to approach 30 degrees, the curve begins to steepen. And it's above 30 degrees that you get this massive drop-off. So we've called this a thermal cliff. So above 30 degrees, you start to fall off the thermal cliff. By the time you get to 40 degrees, you've lost half your species. By the time you reach 50 degrees, there's almost nothing left. And by the time you get to 60 degrees, there really is nothing left. We couldn't find a single species that can cope with temperatures above that. So if you're a species living in a cold region, the temperatures might increase quite substantially, but you're not going to be getting up towards these temperatures where you actually hit your upper limits. I should say, incidentally, in this data set, so we talked before about the fact that there's a huge focus of research on cooler regions. So very little research on impacts of climate change has been done in hot regions. Now, for thermal physiology, in fact, there's been quite a lot of focus on species from hot regions. So thermal physiologists have considered these to be species of interest. And a lot of these studies were not done specifically in the context of studying the impacts of climate change. They were done for the purpose of looking at thermal limits. But in any case, it's between 30 and 40, which is what a lot of people were estimating in the poll. Now, if we can look at how these numbers are dropping off, you can see at 0 we start with 726 species, and most of them are still there at 10. So the number you've lost between 0 and 10 is a very small percentage of 726. The number which are still there at 20 degrees is also, sorry, the number that you lose but between 10 and 20 degrees is a very small percentage of those which were there at 10 degrees. As we get to 30, you can see that this line is actually curving down. So even though we're running out of species, even though we've got fewer and fewer species, the line is still getting steeper and steeper, curving down. So Sanak quantified this. He took the number of species lost between 0 and 10 and divided by 726. And the number of species lost between 10 and 20 and divided by the number there at 10, and looked at this. So this is the percentage losses per, and it looked at it in 3 degree brackets. So 3 degrees is a reasonable estimate of how temperatures might change over the coming century. So we can see that the percentage of species pushed over their limits in a region where the current temperatures are 0 degrees is 0. And if it's currently 3 degrees, again, it's pretty close to 0. If it's 6 degrees, again, it's pretty close to 0. In fact, the percentage of species being pushed over their limits stays pretty close to 0 until we start getting up towards about 30 degrees. Now, beyond 30 degrees, what's interesting is that percentage increases, and it keeps increasing. Yeah? As we get into the upper 40s, we start to run out of species. So this line becomes quite variable. It becomes quite difficult to estimate that percentage when there's not very many species out there. But the key thing is that the percentage losses keep increasing the hotter the region is. Now, in hot regions, as I say, this work was done at the United Arab Emirates University. So the UAE and the Gulf, these desert regions are among the hottest regions in the world. And sometimes we hear people saying, well, you know, in summer, it can hit 50 degrees in the United Arab Emirates. So another couple of degrees doesn't really matter. Now, the thing is that that's not actually true. If it's 50 degrees and it goes up by 2 degrees or 3 degrees, it matters an awful lot. Yeah? So the hotter it currently is, the bigger the impact. If you live in a cold country and it goes up by 3 degrees, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. If you live in a warmish country, it goes up by 3 degrees, it makes a difference. If you live in a hot country, it goes up by 3 degrees. It makes a big difference. And if you live in a very hot country, it makes a huge difference. So it's looking really that species in cold regions are not near to these upper critical temperatures. Species in hot regions are. And the hotter the region, the bigger the risk, the bigger the potential impact. So just to summarize, in cold regions, many species are far below their upper thermal limits. Whereas in the hot regions, more species are approaching these upper thermal limits. And in many cases, they will be pushed over them if temperatures increase. So although it's true that the temperature changes in hot regions are smaller than the temperature changes in cold regions, it's quite possible that the ecological impacts could actually be much greater. So if we're interested in the biodiversity of Africa, whether it's North Africa, whether it's tropical Africa, whichever region of Africa, it's a hot continent. And even though the absolute change in temperature might be less than what you find up in the high north, it may well be that the impact is greater. And of course, in Africa, you've got a number of biomes which are supporting substantial amounts of biodiversity. So, the high northern latitudes are relatively poor in biodiversity. The tropical latitudes tend to be much richer in biodiversity. And it may actually be that these are more vulnerable. As I say, at the moment, less than 1% of global research on impacts of climate change is being focused in these hot regions. At the moment, we're focusing, and we may potentially be focusing on the wrong regions, on the cold regions. And I think we should pay attention to the risks of climate change in hot regions. Good. I'd just like to thank everybody. So we've got the United Arab Emirates University and the funding, the research grant, 31S155, a number of organizations. I'd like to thank the Biodiversity and Development Institute, of course. I'd especially like to thank Les for welcoming me into the fold of the BDI and for inviting me to give this talk. I'd like to thank Rick for chairing the session, and Tasso for helping with these polls and for organizing these meetings, and all these other people. And I'd like to thank Donald Trump for inspiration. Yeah. And any questions?
Thank you very much, David. I was going to say, that those are some very sobering conclusions, and I think that the final slide before your question slide kind of rocked the boat a little bit, but yeah, goodbye. Thanks for a fascinating presentation. Yeah,
we've got a caption for this. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for the rest of mankind.
Very good. Thanks for a very interesting presentation, and yeah, I think quite a few of us, who are involved in birds and ornithology down here, are familiar with the Hot Birds research project, and I'm assuming that there's interaction with with the research that you're doing with the Hot Birds project as well. Are there any questions? Any questions for David?
Yes. I think I saw one. Okay, let me go back. Okay, so Alison is saying, thank you very much. This is a really nice meta-analysis. I wonder if there has perhaps been some bias in the literature for selecting species for thermal assessment that they are suspected to already be near to their thermal limits.
I think that's a very good question, actually. So the sample that we've got here is not a random sample. It's not a structured sample. It's simply a sample of the literature. So that's certainly a good point. One of the concerns that we had with that sample, given that there's so much research, so much climate impact research being focused on the cool latitudes and so little on the hot latitudes, we were worried that the hot latitudes would be underrepresented, and that actually you would have a situation where the upper thermal limits that we're looking at are really the upper thermal limits of species from cold regions. And under the circumstances, it wouldn't be a terribly surprising conclusion if we say, well, the species in hot regions can't fit within that. But these studies were not really conducted in the context of looking at the impacts of climate change. I mean, different people look at this for different reasons, but these are largely thermal physiology studies. And the hot regions are actually quite well represented in this sample. In thermal physiology, there's a phrase which is sometimes used. It's concrete ceilings and plastic floors. And it seems that it's not too difficult to increase the ability of organisms to tolerate cold conditions, but it's quite difficult to increase their ability to tolerate hot conditions. We're talking about ectothermic species here. So I mean, you would imagine that there's a level of adaptation, and to some extent there must be. So if you look at that curve, then the Antarctic mollusk that's dropping dead at 4.5 degrees centigrade, you just can't find that in a hot region. It just can't be there. But that said, most of that graph is showing quite a narrow concentration of upper critical temperatures within this sort of mid-band, the 30 to 40, 40 to 50. But also, I think the question that you're asking is certainly a fair question to do with how do you sample this. And then just more specifically saying there's also, you're selecting species where the thermal assessment is suspected to be already near to the thermal limits. I think if that's the sampling concern, so if that's a specific concern about bias, I think probably not. There's a number of these species have been selected because they live in hot regions, and that's why they've been studied. But I don't think these species have been selected in this sample because the author thinks that they're living near their upper limit. So yeah.
I think that answers very good question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But it's a good question. Yeah.
I think there's also a reference to possible impacts of climate change on high altitude areas, and that seems to tie in as well with hot areas. So that those very small margins also come into play in high altitude areas.
I agree. Yeah. So the 100-meter shift in altitude is equivalent to a very large shift in latitude. So you can get quite big changes. The other thing, the reality of temperature variability is that actually the short range variability, so short range in terms of spatial variability, but also short range in terms of temporal variability, changes through the day, changes from season to season. This short-term variability is actually on a much greater scale than the long-term underlying trend. So over the last 100 years, we're looking at climate change, warming, of between 0.5 and 0.7 degrees centigrade. So that's quite a small signal in a huge amount of noise. My bet is that the temperatures probably fluctuated by that much today, and possibly even in the duration of this meeting. It's not uncommon to see fluctuations within a day of 10, 12 or more degrees centigrade. So I think, and you're quite right that the altitude, temperatures change much more quickly with altitude than they do with latitude. And also, even in sort of micro environments, so shade versus sun, below the ground versus above the ground, you can get big changes. There's also, in this talk, we're focused on ectotherms. and nominally they don't have the physiological capacity for metabolic regulation of body temperature, but some of them have quite sophisticated behavioral mechanisms for regulating body temperature and maintaining body temperatures which are actually different from the microenvironment they're in. So yeah, these are interesting questions. Yeah.
David, that is an interesting point you've just made, the behavioral adaptations.
Yeah.
Have a number of these been documented?
Sure, yes, they've been documented. I mean, some of the lizards, for example, are quite effective at shuttling in and out of the shade, into the sun, into the shade, basking if they want to warm up, disappearing below rocks if they want to stay cool. And then you've got behaviors like using evaporation, moistening themselves and letting the water evaporate. For some of the ectotherms, so with fish, if they're living in water and if they're breathing across their gills, it's more difficult to maintain a thermal gradient with the environment because the water and the blood are essentially flowing right next to each other. But even there, tuna, for example, have got these thermal countercurrent exchange mechanisms in their muscles. So the blood flowing to the muscles is passing across a mesh which intermeshes with the blood flowing from the muscles. And in that way, they can actually maintain muscle temperature, which is quite a lot higher than the water temperature, even though they would normally be deemed to be ectothermic species. So yeah, it's an interesting field. And
I guess I was going to say, I guess a further question would be, have there been recent documented changes in the rate at which these behavior patterns are encountered?
I'm not sure, actually. That would be interesting to look at. I would imagine that these sorts of responses are sort of facultative responses. If they're needed, then they're used. If they're not needed so much, then they're down-regulated a bit. So, yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that you can't necessarily just equate average environmental temperature with body temperature. And if the environmental temperature reaches the upper critical temperature, it doesn't necessarily mean that all the individuals in that population will indeed be wiped out, because you've got all this microenvironment variability, you've got all these behavioral mechanisms in there as well. So yeah, you might find there's more variability and more resilience than you might think. At the same time, one thing to bear in mind, of course, is that if you've got a lot of this short-term variability through time, then you could easily find that your environment reaches upper critical temperatures long before the average temperature reaches these upper critical temperatures. So if your daily range in temperature is indeed, for example, 12 degrees, then you don't want to wait until the average daily temperature is up there. The moment it's about 12 degrees below it, you're going to be entering that range where you're into the danger zone. So I mean, it's a little bit like extreme events. If you only need to have one extreme event to wipe things out. So yeah.
Fascinating. There is a comment from Alison aimed at you, David,
Yep.
where she just says, I've modeled the historical and current species distributions for many taxa using data from the relevant time periods through the last 50 years in Madagascar, looking at the effects of climate and land use change. And there's an indication that there's a lot of range change in response to what we would consider small amounts of climate change. And that seems to support the position that tropical species may be more vulnerable to climate change. So that's fascinating.
Sure.
Great. I think Alison has another comment. Perhaps you can just look at it there, David. Conditioning and epigenetic adaptations too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's certainly a fair point, is that you're going to have acclimation, you've got individuals getting used to temperatures, and you've got adaptation, you've got epigenetic effects. I think that's all certainly true. And yeah, I agree with that. I agree with all of Alice's comments, actually. They're good points.
I guess the question then is, how far can it be pushed within a population?
Well, indeed.
That's the thing. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah,
fantastic.
Too far, I would say.
yeah. Thank you, David, for a fascinating presentation, and I think I think that we've all learned a tremendous amount this evening. Alison, thank you for your contributions as well. Thank you for being part of the discussion this evening, and for just being here. Thanks very much to Chorus as well. I think we've been spoiled this evening once again with two extremely interesting and informative presentations, given us a lot to think about, particularly as citizen scientists. And I think the question that I think as well of now with David's presentation is, what is it that we should be continuing to do or can do differently as citizen scientists in our various contributions to make an even bigger contribution to enable researchers to better approach or be better equipped to approach the kind of research questions that are cropping up at this stage. So I think we would value being directed by the research folk as to how best we can spend our precious time out documenting biodiversity.
Yeah.
So I think let's definitely continue the discussions.
Yeah.
Yes,
just
David.
offering a thought on that, Rick, is one thing I'd definitely say is that, given that there's so much emphasis on cold regions and so little emphasis on hot regions, I think the value of one observation in Africa is so much higher than the value of one observation in temperate northern latitudes in Europe or North America. So I think all of the data that are being collected are gold. And if these issues are indeed much higher risk in this region, then that just even amplifies that even further. So yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I think well, if just on a personal note, as I think we discussed last week, Les put the challenge out there for all of us to get out and visit as many areas as we can, and wherever we are, we should be photo documenting everything, every bit of biodiversity that we can find or lay our eyes on. My telephoto lens arrived just before our webinar started. It had been damaged and it's come back from the garage. The repairs have been done and I can't wait to get out tomorrow. I'm taking a group out to go and try and find a Madagascan cuckoo, which is pitched up 30 k's from Bloemfontein in the center of South Africa. We just this evening at about 5:15 had a record of a greater frigate bird from about 40 kilometers south of Bloemfontein, central South Africa. There have been numerous reports of sooty terns. Both of these seabirds, obviously pelagic seabirds, that have been blown way out of their normal distribution by Cyclone Eloise. So again, it's so important to be capturing these moments as they are all very important in documenting the changes that are taking place on this planet of ours. So